Good afternoon to those in Asia. Good morning to people listening in Europe. Welcome to this webinar from EU SME Center in conjunction with the China Britain Business Council. My name is Rafael. I work for the EU SME Center, and you're very welcome to this exciting webinar on the smart cities in China. Topics to be covered long, so I will immediately hand out the microphone to one of the speakers. We have here in China Kirk Wilson, and we have in Europe Patrick Lee. I remind you that even if all the questions in this webinar cannot be responded, you can always write your question, and we will take care to get to you back immediately or as soon as possible. I hand out the microphone now to Mr. Wilson. Enjoy this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rafa. Hi, thanks, Rafael. It's a pleasure to come and do the second webinar from me, actually. I did one recently on ICT, where we covered a little bit of the smart cities area and then a lot of other much broader subjects in technology. Today, we're going to focus a bit on technology also. This webinar is a follow-up to the EU SME Sector report on smart cities, which was very technology-focused, which was published recently. I've also invited my colleague Patrick Lee, who will join us to give more of the infrastructure sector of the smart cities, so we'll combine the two. First, a brief introduction for those who are not familiar with myself. So I'm the Executive Director of China Britain Business Council in China. I'm also the lead for technology industries, and my background has all been in tech. So I've been working for companies like EDS, the American IT services companies, amongst others. So hopefully quite familiar with the tech aspects of smart cities in China. I'm joined by Patrick Lee. Patrick, if you'd like to have a quick introduction.
Hi everyone, I think nobody could hear that first sentence. My name is Patrick Lee. Although I'm in Europe at the moment, I'm actually based in Beijing, and I have been working in this sector of infrastructure and energy environment since 2004, first at the Embassy of Belgium and then for Belgian SMEs, and now latest since 2014 for the China Britain Business Council.
Okay, thanks very much, Patrick. Apologies to listeners if it sounds slightly disjointed. I'm having to put on headphones to actually get Patrick's voice there, so that's why there's a slight delay. So looking at the agenda today, as I said, I'm going to give a brief overview of the smart cities market in China. I'm going to focus a little bit on the tech because this is coming from the EU SME Sector Report that we published recently. I'll then hand over to Patrick, who will talk basically around the infrastructure and some of the trends in smart cities we're seeing with a focus on three specific areas. That's sponge cities to do with water conservation, vertical cities, the building of super tall buildings, and BIM, the building information modeling. I'll then come back and talk more on the technology and applications of smart cities, in particular do a subsector review and focus on some of the opportunities for EU SMEs and look at some of the EU SMEs that we've come across working in the industry in China. I'll then finish with some practical advice and a basic 10-point plan just for doing business in China in general, but with a bit of a smart cities angle on it. First of all, a brief definition of smart cities. According to IBM, this is from the technology side of things, smart cities are designed to utilize information and telecoms methods to sense, analyze, and integrate various pieces of key information from core systems used in city operations, and very importantly, to respond intelligently to a variety of needs relating to the environment, public security, city services, commercial activities, and citizens' livelihoods, etc. We look at smart cities in terms of three distinct tiers and analyze it from that perspective. So that's the data acquisition tier, looking at the sensing devices, some of the hardware that goes into smart cities. Then at the service tier, which is some of the broader applications and services that are provided, and then the specific application tier. Again, that's from the technology side. In terms of the infrastructure that goes underneath there, of course, we'll look a bit at smart water, we'll look at smart energy, transport, and then also healthcare, which is an important part of smart applications for citizens. There are some key growth drivers that are really pushing interest in smart cities in China. I mean, the whole world is looking at this area. Increasing urbanization is not unique to China, but of course China is the country that has the biggest movement and the biggest urbanization currently. In 2014, the government published the New Town Planning Notice, and that's a 6-year plan for a new administrative management model to be developed in pilot cities, which prioritizes administrative tiers and district region design and planning to increase effectiveness and lower costs. This is in line with China's, as we call it, new normal economy. The title of this webinar reflects that. Previously, we've seen a dramatic growth of cities, and we're really moving now from a period of quantity in terms of growth to quality, where the government focus is much more on the quality of life for citizens and then the quality of the cities themselves and sustainability of those. The other driver, of course, for smart cities is new generation information technologies. So the last 10 years or so have really seen the coming together of various technologies that have been in the works for many years, but they're not being there has really meant that although some of the theory of the technology that can underpin smart cities has been there, the actual applications have not been possible. They are now because of intelligent devices, sensors, cameras, smart terminals, robotics, of course, and the whole Internet of Things space. And these are being applied to water, to weather prediction, to energy, to the environment, and basically making everything sensing and then connecting and recording all of that data for use in applications further on. Another key aspect, of course, is the telecoms that enable the distribution of all this data across the cities. So the 5G platform is going to present huge opportunities. And in particular, the UK is partnering with China in this area quite extensively. And the tech company Huawei have a partnership with Surrey University in the UK to build a 5G testbed in Surrey, which is essentially a mock-up over a few square kilometres of what a potential future 5G network might look like with all the latest technology. And then global companies can take some of their latest applications and tech into that testbed to see how it reacts in there. Of course, the point made at the end of this slide, it's really all about the data, the tech side of smart cities. Some of the key government departments that you need to know about if you're looking at smart cities in China, NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, they're tasked with promoting and driving smart city builds, and that's from the perspective of dealing with urbanization. There's also MIIT, that's the main technology department, the ones that I deal with mostly with my remit in tech, and they look at policy, standards, and evaluation processes for informatization, which is this nice complicated word that we use in China to replace various other words like digitization that we use in the West. There's also the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development, MOHURD, which has led and organized pilot smart city identification in China, so choosing which cities are going to be on the list of pilot cities. They also have the Digital City Engineering Research Center, which is managed by MOHURD, so it's worth taking a look at that for more information on what they're planning. Of course, the Ministry of Finance, which is tasked with the allocation, monitoring, and control of budgets in smart city builds, and then the local and city governments. I put the local and city governments on there as a fairly generic term, but to make the point that when you're doing business in China in general, they should always be on this list of key government departments. It's really the local and city governments who are going to make or break the works and the deals that you enter into in local areas. Key point from this slide, key challenge. There's no clear working mechanism among all of the government departments, and there's no coherent set of smart city regulation. That's very important to remember because on the one hand, that creates a lot of frustration in that there's no standards way of applying this thing called a smart city and no standards to work to. But on the other hand, of course, that opens a lot of opportunities. So some of the big European companies here are actually promoting some of the European standards to be used here in smart cities. So it opens up the opportunities for some companies. The market size is hard to judge, obviously. There's lots of different aspects to smart cities and the definitions vary. But I've just taken one here from International Data Corporation, which estimates 2014 that the size of smart city builds, excluding related equipment and automation applications, is $13 billion and could reach about 28 billion US in 2020. The National Development Bank agreement with Moherd on national smart cities investment reached 11.8 billion euros, 80 billion renminbi. And of course, there will be many new plans in the Shusao, the 13th five-year plan, which is just in the planning stages now and will shortly be announced. So we're expecting a lot more investment to be announced then. There are around 400 Moherd official pilot smart cities or enlargement projects or special projects in China. I mentioned that big number because yes, it is a big opportunity. There's clearly a big market here, and lots of places that particularly EU SMEs can go and test their technologies and test out models for cooperation. Lots of different places, it's easy to get into the market in that sense. But on the other hand, it can be very confusing. And as I said, the lack of standards and the lack of codification of, for example, data sharing means that there can be great differences between the way that these smart cities are implemented. So it can be a challenge also. Talking of challenges, there are many legal and regulatory issues to deal with in China. China is a fairly bureaucratic business environment, so this is true across a lot of industries. The government has issued a lot of what we call guidance, but actually quite few practical regulations around data protection, standardization, information sharing, definitions, for example. The PPP model is widely discussed in China. That's certainly something you'll probably all be quite familiar with in the smart cities area as a way of financing some of these projects. But in fact, in China, the definitions and best practice of PPP is unclear. And of course, as we know, in China, the definition of what is a private and public company can be quite challenging sometimes also, with quite heavy state ownership of big companies, as well as obviously the state-owned SOEs that are part of the government. That actually, again, although it's very challenging, it also opens up opportunities. So CBBC currently have quite a lot of activity around this. We've had events in, I think it's around 10 cities now in China. The last one was in Jinan, which had over 500 people go to learn more about what is PPP and how is it done in Europe, and in particular in the UK. It's great to be out there, spreading the word and hopefully introducing some examples of standardization which might be used. But nonetheless, we do raise that as a challenge, that there is, for example, no clear working mechanism between the government departments to agree on how to implement these things. There are also market barriers. The approach to master planning in China can be very inconsistent. So this again goes to the idea that the question of what is a smart city, and actually the definitions can be quite vague and loosely interpreted. So you get a lot of varying projects. There's also poor data openness. Chinese governments are fairly closed when it comes to sharing data, in particular with citizens and with companies. They're also fairly bad at sharing data between local governments, in fact. So getting the data to go from, say, Guangzhou up to Jinan can be quite challenging because of some competition between the provinces. Again, this makes it difficult to look at implementing nationwide schemes, but opens opportunities for some companies to work directly with local governments to implement those kind of standards. Of course, the next point about that, of course, is incompatible solutions. There are a lot of companies who are here putting together bespoke solutions. We raise that as an opportunity, but nonetheless, a lot of EU SMEs will be relying on there being a certain amount of standardization between the different projects in China to enable them to promote their solutions in different areas, and that can be very challenging because of the bespoke solutions that have been put in place. There's also no comprehensive laws around data and privacy protection. British and EU companies working here will need to think carefully about their home markets, laws around data and privacy. And given that the environment here can be fairly grey, it can be quite difficult to make sure that you're abiding by the laws in China and then also abiding by the laws and regulations of your home country. So that's something to bear in mind. As I mentioned, the PPP model is fairly poorly understood in China. There's a lot of interest in doing it, and every local government will tell you that they're looking at PPP models. And what that means, of course, is getting private investment into some of these projects, and that's a great thing. I think most people would agree that that's very necessary in the current environment. But in terms of standardization of how that's done and what it means, and in particular then, what is the security that can be given to foreign companies who want to engage in that kind of model, is fairly poorly understood and can be different across different areas. So it's worth doing a lot of research on that before you get involved with these kind of projects. The final point there, I've just made up this term actually, dumb cities. All I mean there is smart city projects which are not smart city projects. So there's a lot of incentives from the government in China to going into smart cities. So a lot of real estate developers will try to give a certain gloss of technology, advanced technology or eco or sustainable or smart to real estate projects in order to get those incentives. Often local governments play along with that if they are very interested in getting the developments done with central government support. So that's something really to look out for. Is that the smart city projects that you're getting involved with have the genuine background of smart requirements that you need to implement your solutions. The last market barrier there, I put it under market barriers, although this actually reflects government regulation, but nonetheless I put it here because I think we've understood that the security or information security situation in China is fairly challenging for foreign technology companies. China had the National Information Security Strategy, and I mentioned that in some more detail in the other ICT report that we've done for EU SME Sector, so you can have a check for a bit more information there. But essentially what this means is that the government is asking foreign companies to share quite extensively their IP, including encryption and source code. A lot of foreign companies have a concern about that because the Chinese government is quite close to a lot of their competitors, Chinese companies, especially the big state-owned companies, and they worry about the potential for data leakage if a lot of people get to know some of these, basically trade secrets of their companies. So that can be a bit of a challenge, and it's worth just reviewing what are the requirements for sharing some of your core IP when working or starting JVs in China to make sure that you're comfortable with that in order to take part in the project. The other challenge here is localization, and this is just a very straightforward barrier actually, but we come across it again and again, and I think some of the things I've shared about a poor understanding of PPP, although you see this term a lot, a different understanding of what is a smart city, this kind of things, a lot of it can come down to sort of cultural challenges as well. So just interpreting what are the Chinese cultural aspects of city design, what do the people and the government really want cities to be looking like, what is some of the behavior that can be expected, how should we go about data analysis, and what are the expectations of citizens. They can be quite different across different areas of China, so it's worth remembering that it's not one homogeneous market in that sense. So at this point, I'll hand over to Patrick Lee to talk a bit more about the infrastructure and some of the trends in smart cities.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can see that. So, as Kirk said, I'm going to be responsible to talk a little bit about the hardware of the smart city concept. So by hardware, we mean anything that is built out of concrete, so the cities that we are living in. And there, in that regards, the designers and master planners have a slightly different view on what a smart city might be. In the tech world, it doesn't really matter what kind of infrastructure you have. You can always make it smart by just adding technology to it. In the infrastructure section, it's actually more about making cities smarter so that people can actually live in it and create history. because cities are living places, and so what architects want to achieve is really creating places where culture can happen. So whenever, I think some people can't see my screen, so I hope that people over there can see that. I'm going to drop right into the concept of sponge cities, because that's probably when I was thinking about what to talk about. With regards to smart cities, then immediately this sponge city concept came to mind, which right now in China is really fashionable to talk about. But where does it actually come from? And this first picture, just to give you an idea of why China urgently needs to rethink the way it builds its cities. So this is just the amount of cement that China has used for buildings over the span of 2011 to 2013, and you can see it has used almost double as much of cement within a span of 3 years than the US has used in almost 100 years. So the problem with Chinese cities is that they've really just concreted over whole stretches of land without thinking what might happen if rain falls more than it should. So although China has a drainage network which spans for about 600,000 kilometers, that's a number from 2013. That means it was 20 times longer in 2013 than it was in 1981. But at the same time, cities has grown at a much faster pace. And so the drainage system in most of the cities in China just can't keep up with the expansion of these cities. At the same time, there's a vast majority of China's cities, especially in the north, that face serious water shortage. So of the 657 cities that were assessed by an assessment of the Ministry of Housing and Rural Urban Development, about half of them were considered water scarce or severely water scarce when compared to standards of the United Nations. So in about 2013, this concept of a sponge city was started to talk about. Now, this concept is not something new. I mean, developers have used this concept for a long time, and it basically just means that we want to retain the water where it's necessary, but also make sure that the water can leave as fast as possible so as not to block roads and urban infrastructure. So there was a lot of talk ahead of 2013 about this concept, and it's been used abroad in different cities before. I think most notable in Los Angeles, where they built a vast underground network to remove overspill water. But in 2013, the President Xi Jinping got wind of this concept, and so in a speech to urban planners in 2013, he called for the strengthening of the development of sponge cities. And with that, he just created a slogan which cities then started to take over. And it's taken a couple of years, but in the last year, the Chinese central government has pledged to give money to 16 different cities in China to morph them into urban sponges. So these are 16 cities that have been chosen for a 3-year period, and they're going to be given 400 million RMB per year over this period to implement sponge cities. Now, there's no real concept of what it means, whether that means retrofitting a grey infrastructure or whether it means to completely rebuild cities, because some of these 16 cities are cities that have already a long history, and basically they would need to be rethought from the base. Now, we do have a few companies that are working on the smart city concept, and one of the companies has told me that actually, if a city were to be retrofitted in a way that Western companies think about smart city concept, then that would actually be a huge cost, because the amount of reshaping the city would mean that we would have to spend about the same cost per meter of new grey infrastructure as a city is spending in China now on creating 1 meter of subway line. So it's a massive undertaking, and is going to easily outstrip the 400 million RMB of a city that has been set aside. So what really is needed in this design process right now, in the process of starting to think about smart cities, is companies getting into those cities, and the list of smart cities we can send you in after this webinar, and really talk to these cities about what it means to smartly redesign these cities, because that's going to be a multidisciplinary project which is going to be needing a lot of planning and managing of different resources. I said there is a list of 16 cities, but that doesn't mean that other cities are not going to try and implement and get on the bandwagon of this smart city concept. Basically, all the cities that we've visited at CBBC for our different infrastructure events all wanted us to talk about smart cities. And that's from Hainan all the way up to Changchun. Everybody wants to talk about smart city now, and that obviously creates good opportunities if city officials are interested in listening to foreign advice on how to recreate cities. There's also a lot of talk the central government wants to use PPP for this approach. But Kirk has already said there's a lack of understanding on the government side of what implementation of PPP projects actually mean. And I actually got quite a good example for that. We had a company come in last week, a Chinese company, who says that they're building cities all around China for on behalf of Chinese governments. And they're using the PPP model to build those cities. But when I asked what does that mean, PPP projects building whole cities, what they meant is just the city is giving us the ground, we can use it for 70 years. We use our own money to build the city and to build the infrastructure, and the whole process of actually planning the 70 years lifespan of this city is done in anything between 6 months and 12 months before the actual building of the city starts. So obviously there's a huge misunderstanding of what a smart PPP project means. And companies that are working on these projects, foreign companies working on these projects, will run into that issue very soon. So we will have to do a lot more work on getting them to understand what it means to build a city with a long-term view on things. Here's an example of a company. This is a UK company who is working on smart city projects in China. So Hydro International, with a base in Shanghai, have supplied one of these systems that we see here in the picture to the city of Anhui. And the problem with the city of Anhui was that they had a lot of stormwater drainage, which spilled over to their wastewater treatment plants. And the engineers didn't know what to do with the excess water and how to make sure that the excess water of spillage of a river is not flowing back into their wastewater. So the system that Hydro International provided made sure that there was a filtration and a leakage protection between the rivers and the water treatment plant and the households. moving on to the next section of this Smart City report. We're talking about vertical cities here, and many of the companies that we are working with at CBBC are working on concepts for vertical cities, how to implement eco-friendly cities within one building. And China is really the place to be doing this kind of implementation, because nobody builds more tall buildings than China. As you can see here in 2015, China had completed 62 200-meter plus buildings. And of the 10 buildings that are going to be completed in 2016, I think, I have to check the numbers here, I think 7 of them, 6 of the 10 buildings that are going to be completed in 2016 are also going to be built and completed in China. So obviously this trend is probably going to continue. There are still 300 super tall buildings under construction in China to be completed by before 2020. And with cities embracing more transport-oriented development concepts, it's going to be quite certain that more cities are going to be interested in building skyscrapers that can house entire communities and that are mixed use and can be easily accessed by transport. So in tall cities, we really believe that there's going to be many opportunities. Some of the companies that we're working with are already working a lot on the concepts, on master planning that includes tall buildings. But then main opportunities, I believe, are going to be in the management of these buildings. Because these buildings, they're going to have a lifespan of between 60 and 65 years or even longer. And a lot of management companies in China simply don't have the sophistication at this point and the experience that would make it possible for them to manage these buildings in a smart way, so that they actually keep the opportunity that they have when they were built. We also believe that all of these green buildings certification providers are going to be in demand, because of the fact that the more of these tall buildings are trying to become climate neutral. We recently had a building in Guangzhou which actually had on the top of the building its own mill, its own power generation built in. It doesn't provide power for the whole building, for all of the energy used in the whole building at this point, but it's a concept, it's a start to think about how to make these buildings smart and green. And we do think that consultation on green building certification and making these buildings energy efficient is going to be in demand. Moving on to building information modeling, and that's actually very closely related to super tall buildings. So a report which was issued in last year by Autodesk reported that there should be 108% growth of BIM adaptation in China by 2017. And the companies the developers that we are talking to definitely are very much interested in adapting BIM while they're growing. But the problem is that it's similar to the PPP model. In China there's still a lack of understanding on how BIM can actually be used to manage a building throughout its whole lifespan. And there we will need to spend more time on talking to developers and really getting, especially the smaller developers, and really getting them to understand the opportunities for them in adapting BIM. There's also, right now in China, there's no coherent certification system in place. And we do have a couple of providers who are trying to get into the market and really help China to set up a system that can be used universally to really understand, to really assess people and companies and the abilities they have in working with BIM. And there we have a few large-scale projects in China, like the Shanghai Tower and the Beijing Zun, which are creating the base for future regulations. And I'm going to give an example just in a bit on how this actually works and how these projects are being used to create a catalog of building guidelines and working with BIM. The trend towards whole life approach of projects by developers in China is going to be favoring foreign competitors in the market who have experience in planning and building projects, infrastructure projects, that then will keep the value over the whole of the lifespan and will keep on providing growth for the developer during the lifespan of the building. So I touched on it a little bit just before already. Development of guidelines, training and creating of data exchange programs is going to be very important over the next 5 years, I would say, while China is building up its expertise on BIM. Now I'm going to give you an example which was done by one of our members at CBBC, Arab, who has been working on that tall building that you see in the middle there, the Beijing Zun, which is slowly taking shape now in the middle of CBD here in Beijing. It's due to be completed by 2018, and it's going to be the tallest building in this area. And the planning for this has actually started very early in 2010, 2011 already, where Arab was chosen to be part of a consortium to look into how to efficiently build this tower in the middle of Beijing. So Arab had been working on that together with KPF, and on the Chinese side they had companies like CITIC and the Beijing Institute of Architectural Design that was part of that consortium. And the reason why this was chosen as a project to work on with BIM is because it's a massive investment, first of all. It has a very long development time, and it is a very complex technology that's being built into this building. Plus, there are multiple partners, not just in the build-up, but also then in the management of the building. So in order to really make the best out of this ground and the project itself, BIM had to be implemented to make sure to create a catalog of how to build this building smart and how to keep it running for a long time. So that led to this consortium making a catalog of regulations and standards which helps them to improve the collaboration workflow, and it has also led to setting up an execution framework which is constantly updated while the project is being built up. And so we believe with all these buildings being built right now in China and the trend not stopping right now, at least not in the foreseeable future, BIM adaptation, transport-oriented development experts are really going to be the companies that can make headway here in China in this trend in going from quantity to quality. That's what was my part of the Smart City webinar, and I'm handing back to Kirk now, who's going to talk a little bit further about his presentation.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Patrick. As a very interesting look at those three particular aspects of smart cities. Going back now to the technology side of things, I'm going to focus on a couple of specific areas of tech application. These are areas that we've noticed there are particular opportunities in China. In the Chinese market, we're talking a lot about these areas, and in particular, we're seeing not only some strong Chinese companies making gains in the market, but also some foreign companies doing quite well. That's why we've highlighted these particular areas, because they have some real potential for EU SMEs in particular. So the first one here is smart energy. The high-level strategy for Internet Plus energy and smart energy was submitted to the State Council in June 2015. And it's a big market. So electricity user sales and construction investment plus Internet Plus energy and smart energy in China is estimated at about 5 trillion renminbi. So there's lots of opportunity there. And, and Internet Plus is a term that I might use a few times here. It basically just means the integration of internet technologies into other industries, and that's elaborated in more detail in the other ICT report. And there's lots of material on the internet you can look at for that also. Intel also announced in May 2015 that it will build a joint laboratory to promote internet-connected energy with China, Smart Energy Union. That's a very key deal to highlight, I think, because it shows that foreign companies are making big investments into this area and increasing their investments. So there's lots of opportunity. Some of the big key players are outlined here. You'll see that a lot of these are in particular, let's focus on Sungrow. I think it's a nice example of a company that previously has focused on solar PV, photovoltaic energy. Obviously, that market is seeing some challenges in China. So as with a lot of Chinese companies, they're looking to adapt away from some industries that are seeing challenges and into new opportunities. So smart energy is a place where a lot of these companies that have formerly worked in other energy applications are moving. There's also Bellsite, one of the big state-owned software companies who are looking at energy saving. We've also highlighted the IES Lab, an integrator for smart grid. There's a very big project on smart grid being undertaken now. Again, you can get a bit more information in the ICT report. There's a lot of opportunity there. And of course, to do with the automation applications as well. So the company Wiscom that we've highlighted, who are looking at plant automation and also smart substations. Not forgetting this, the whole online aspect. So Nari are a company who built an e-commerce platform for power exchange. So looking at new ways of using the online capabilities to help this industry. Online in China, and in particular mobile in China, has seen a dramatic growth. Again, you can read more in the ICT report. All of these subsectors are building a lot of their new innovations on that platform and trying to integrate mobile users to, for example, pay their energy bills and that kind of thing. There are lots of opportunities in energy saving consultation in particular. So a lot of Chinese companies would like to upgrade their capabilities and need foreign companies to give them consultancy. In new energy development, there are opportunities, in particular, as I mentioned, the online, so the building of cloud platforms, and also the remote meter and monitoring and big data operation, which are growth areas across markets in all different countries, but in particular, big data is a big opportunity in China. The challenge there, of course, is that data is a very sensitive issue in China, and they like to make sure that the data is well controlled, and in particular, for example, the data is held on servers in China. That's one requirement for companies. So you have to be sure that you're able to comply with those regulations whilst also maintaining your competitive advantage and control over the data that you're generating. Smart transport is the next sector that we'll take a look at. It's probably the most developed of the so-called smart industries in China. It was certainly one of the first to embrace smart concepts. A lot of cities have undertaken smart transport projects, traffic flow monitoring, parking, this kind of thing. There are a whole series of smart city developers, some of the big developers, who are making use of top-level designers from abroad and system integrators and solution providers who are capable of providing some quite advanced solutions for smart transport projects. In particular, I've highlighted here internet for vehicles. We saw an estimate recently, I don't have a reference on here, but I can add that later to the report, that about 80% of the cars in China in future may be automated. And it will be, of course, the world's largest market, because it will be the world's largest market for cars. But in particular, this study found that the Chinese drivers are particularly interested in automation and less interested in the sort of driving quality of the cars, and more interested in things like safety and this kind of thing, which lends itself to automation. So they estimate that the percentage of cars on the roads automated will be very, very high in China. Some of the key players, Navinfo, looking at data and content services around digital mapping and also internet of vehicles. AutoNavi, similar digital mapping and navigation. Hikvision's an interesting company because they are making video camera technology, webcam, virtual videos, and also working in image analysis. So CCTV, of course, is a very big industry in China. With a keen eye on the security of public places and airports, this kind of thing. So there are lots of EU SME companies and British small companies who are making headway in that area. Dahua Technology, another big Chinese company, making strides globally, actually, in smart cities. So they do monitoring products and solutions, and they've actually won a project to supply the London Underground. So that's a very successful example of a Chinese technology company doing well abroad. And also CISIS, they're a system integrator for transportation systems, so highways, tunnels, bridge, and the management of those. The opportunities are quite broad in this area, of course, to do with the Internet of Vehicles, but then also the urban management, traffic management. So in Hangzhou, I've highlighted this project there, which was quite interesting to take a look at, the 134 system, which is looking to build an extensive data center, 3 separate platforms for telecoms data and traffic integration and GIS, and an applications, 4 application systems around decision analysis, simulation and evaluation. They're also aiming to integrate aviation and rail projects into that one big urban management platform. So it's a very interesting project to look at for opportunities of integrating niche technologies from Europe into those. And I re-mentioned their driverless cars. I think that will, in general, be a very big opportunity in years to come. Smart healthcare. Healthcare itself is a huge industry in China. At CBBC, we have a whole very successful subsector group in healthcare here in Beijing, and they've been extremely active this year. China's undertaking a major healthcare reform. But there are major challenges associated with the reform, in particular around the fact that China is, simply put, a vast country. So trying to get a consistent level of quality in healthcare across the country is a huge, huge challenge. So that's generating all kinds of opportunities for smart solutions around e-records, hospital informatization, remote medical treatment in particular, and e-healthcare, remote diagnosis over the internet. And then the e-commerce, again, e-commerce platforms around this. So in healthcare, that's to do with medicine distribution. Also in wearable devices that connect homes and people to the internet. Really huge market here in China. Also, healthcare is, relatively speaking, quite an open market for most subsectors in healthcare. There are lots of European companies who are really making strides here. I mean, the UK in particular with the NHS. That's why we see a lot of activity at CBBC, but also a lot of companies, and I mentioned a few of them here, are doing very, very well. And relative to other subsectors, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I've highlighted some of the key players here, just looking down, going right to the end, actually. Longmaster is one we've been looking at closely. They're developing some quite good e-health solutions and diagnostics. A lot of activity around the payment for medicine, so medicine payments and medical insurance in particular, with the insurance sector opening up to domestic companies. Foreign companies are still seeing a challenge, of course, in that particular area. Just to restate the opportunities, wearable devices is probably the number one that we're looking at. All of the big tech companies are interested in this area. The development of e-commerce platforms that link people into into or link people who are in remote areas to be able to actually even buy some of these medicines and get them distributed is huge. Hospital informatization, social healthcare, insurance payments, and of course electronics records. Nationwide data sharing is an opportunity, but of course also a challenge in trying to get this data standardized and codified and communicated across the country. In terms of EU SMEs that are active in China, as I said, there's quite a lot. In terms of companies overall, I was lucky enough to catch up with two major British companies in the smart cities sector just before this webinar, actually. Arup and Mott MacDonald came to visit us at the British Centre. They had some interesting things to say about the smart cities market, in particular that they're seeing a lot of competition between foreign companies here. I thought that was quite an interesting development, in that, you know, as foreign companies are trying to address the smart cities market and deal with these different players in China, from governments, from Chinese developers to systems integrators, because of all the space that's there, the kind of grey aspect to the market and the lack of standards and codification, a lot of different companies are making their own way and coming up with their own bespoke solutions. So they're developing a lot of competition between the different foreign companies here to be successful. As Patrick also mentioned, Arup and Mott also restated that BIM is proving quite complicated, and there's not a high level of understanding of what is BIM and how it should be implemented as standard. So we're seeing a lot of different applications of that. One other thing they mentioned, which was particularly interesting for me, is that the way to implement a smart city is also developing quickly. I mean, both in China and across the world, obviously. And they mentioned in particular that in order to implement smart cities, all of these, whether it's technology applications or the hardware, the concrete, as Patrick mentioned, they all really need to be integrated into city plans in the beginning, not compartmentalized into little areas. So that's the challenge they have, is working with the cities to make sure that the applications are adapted into city plans rather than in compartmental fashion. So it's worth, when you come to China with your business in smart cities, it's worth thinking about that aspect. The last thing they said is that, I think, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are about 400 individual smart cities or projects in China. And that can be hugely complicated, and some of them are not even smart cities at all. So navigating that environment is a challenge. They suggested that companies should focus on Beijing and Shanghai in particular. First of all, it's a place that we need to make those big cities smart first before moving into the smaller areas. I would perhaps challenge that in terms of EU SMEs. I think there are lots of opportunities in the other cities. And perhaps the bigger companies might focus on the big cities, but for smaller companies who are really interested in developing some bespoke solutions with Chinese partners, the smaller cities have a lot of opportunities. I mentioned a few companies here on this slide. I wonder if Patrick, do you want to come back in on a couple of the infrastructure companies here?
Sure, yeah.
When we talk about the infrastructure part of this smart city webinar, companies that we're working quite often with is, for example, Arup, who has very strong capabilities in the smart city concepts. Also, as we heard in the report that I gave, BIM is very strong for Arup as well. They're also working on quite a few super tall buildings in China. Then another company is Hydro Smart Water Monitoring, which I talked about in the report, in the webinar as well. Then our colleagues from the EU SME Center have given me a link to Ingenor, an architectural company from Spain, who was awarded an award for Eco-City Master Planning of Kunshan City. A company I'm quite familiar with is Vito, a company that was privatized from the government in Flanders, in Belgium, and that has been working with the Chinese government on air and water quality monitoring since 2005, I believe. They have an office in Beijing, and they're working quite strongly together with local governments in different provinces in China. Then there's a platform that I would like to mention, which is the Smart Water for Europe platform, SW for EU, which is showcasing water solutions in a project that they're doing in order to network water utilities across Europe, which is something that in the future could probably be quite interesting with regards to China. Other companies worth mentioning is PLP Architecture from the UK, which has strengths in super tall buildings. Then we have Haskell, which is very strong in eco-city master planning as well as retail-oriented developments. Space Syntax is another very interesting company who is doing spatial recognition through computer algorithms in order to help cities and developers to really use space that they build to its best value. Other companies worth mentioning are Binoy, another architectural company who is very strong in China, has been working here for quite a long time. Modern Water, based in Shanghai, is another company worth mentioning. They are working on desalination projects, but also on water monitoring, similar to Hydro that I mentioned before. And last but not least, Sure Architecture, another UK company which has made some headlines last year with their vertical city designs, as well as designs where they're planning to have ecological platforms on the sea.
Okay, so on the technology and application side, we've got a few interesting companies working in China. Of course, the integrated circuits that underlie smart cities, the little chips that are going into all of the wireless and wearable devices, there's a company called Sonjul. They're an interesting practical example because they basically do not compete with the big manufacturers of integrated circuits, but they design bespoke circuit new designs which they can do. They can supply that service to the big players. So they've found a niche in the market where they can be very successful. The company Micro Focus, another interesting one in that they focus on mainframe solutions. So a lot of the computing technology that's currently being used to manage cities, of course, there's an effort to upgrade those and put a lot of these on the cloud and really bring them up to the internet age. But nonetheless, there's a lot of older technology there, which is still a fundamental part of city management solutions. So any European company that has experience in some of these perhaps older technologies, but can bring that to niche areas in China, could perhaps find some opportunities. The company Indigo Vision, again, a CCTV example, huge amounts of projects going on in CCTV and other image analysis and what have you across public sites in China. So they're doing very well in airports and other smart building and city applications. There's a company called Test Plant who make automated software testing. So that points to the opportunity in increasing the quality of some of these software systems that are being developed in the smart cities area. And also Paragon Logistics there. So they're a company who make a niche software solution for smart logistics. So again, it's quite a small company, and they make an application that can be used in bespoke installations across different cities. One other thing to mention here is that along with the trend to look at smart cities and sponge cities and implementing all of this new generation technology, China is undergoing a number of different reforms. I mentioned the opportunity around healthcare reform. And one other thing that's going on, of course, is what's called the Made in China 2025 initiative. Now, this initiative is aimed at upgrading Chinese manufacturing across the board, across China, across all industries. It's a huge project, and actually at CBBC we're in the middle of writing a report about it right now. I mention that because in looking at the implications for technology development in China, in particular in smart city applications, it's worth keeping an eye on the progress of that project, because that will have implications for how Chinese companies wish to integrate and partner with foreign companies. So you can learn more about that from the report that we're putting together right now. So thank you very much for listening today. I do apologize for some of the technical issues that we've had trying to put together the Beijing team and our correspondent in Switzerland, as well as a fairly complicated technology platform has meant we've suffered a bit from that. But hopefully you've managed to get most of the information and you found it useful. I'm going to address a couple of questions now that have come in, and if you have any further questions, do feel free to type them into the system, and my assistant here will help me to view those. Okay, so great question. Out of 400 Moherd city projects, how many are smart and how many are dumb? Well, great specific question. I don't know the answer to that. You know, when you, of course, all the projects are promoted as smart. I expect of those 400, the vast majority are pretty good, are decent, and you would not come across the problem that I'm talking about here of dumb cities. There are thousands of cities and towns in China trying to implement different projects. And when I say dumb cities, it is perhaps better to broaden that a bit to, you know, dumb applications and projects. So you'll often find, you know, the classic sort of real estate venture or project that aims to position itself as smart, but then in fact isn't. But of the, you know, these broad projects that are sponsored by Moherd, I expect, at least in the broad strokes, the main projects themselves will have a certain element of smart, if you like, or be quite good quality projects. There's another question. I'll just take a look. Okay, that's an interesting one. It's a specific question from a retailer, but if the questioner doesn't mind, I'll broaden that out a little. It's a question about if you're in a business that's related to, you know, sort of eco, green, sustainable, this kind of area, does it make sense to associate yourself with smart cities in China and try to position yourself in those cities, for example, in those city pilot projects, in order to be successful? I think the answer to that is probably yes, in the sense that you'll get very good backing from the local government. As I said, there's a lot of incentives being ploughed into some of these smart projects and sustainable projects. So that's absolutely true. But of course, you know, when you're doing business anywhere, the main thing you're thinking of is the interest and market demand for your product. So I would look more carefully at what is the market demand in a particular city, rather than focusing on the existence of smart projects to do that. So, I mean, for example, Beijing is not necessarily recognized as a smart city above all others, but nonetheless, there's a huge amount of interest in eco and sustainable as a fairly, you know, modern city with a lot of middle class consumers who are interested in that. So I don't think there's any particular advantage from the market aspect, but you certainly would get good support from governments with, you know, applications or services that are related to eco and sustainable. Okay, that's the last of the questions. There are just a couple more things that I do want to just highlight here. I'm not going to go through in any detail, but just to put up the practical advice or 10-point plan. It's a very similar 10-point plan that we often discuss with companies who have come to China to do business. So I put it up here for your information. And I've just added a few particular smart city aspects to it. So number one, finding niche markets. Patrick already outlines things like sponge cities. There are particular areas of difficulty in China, like parking, and then particular areas of opportunity, like China is really racing ahead in Internet of Things technology. So finding those particular niches and working with those is a very good way of addressing the market. Skipping down IP and due diligence, number 4. I mentioned, you know, these real estate projects, dumb projects and what have you that really aren't smart city. Making sure that you're dealing with good partners, and in particular that the government partners that you're dealing with have the incentives are in line with what you're looking for from the project, and that your IP is protected is very important. And generally speaking, of course, protect your IP globally and in China before you start doing business here. Skipping down again, M&A and investment is a huge opportunity in China at the moment. Chinese companies will ask you about that, I'm sure, if you start to do business here, because they're really interested in integrating new technologies from foreign companies into their solutions. So always, be aware of what your position is on that kind of opportunity should it come up. Number 8, aligning yourself with the strategic emerging industries. Being in the smart cities sort of area itself is actually an act of aligning with a very key priority for the Chinese government already. So you're in a good space by doing that. But there's lots of government incentives available for companies that can successfully align themselves with some of these industries. And then skipping down to number 10, open IP environment. That's a pretty tech-focused guidance or practical point. But actually what we mean here is just being flexible about your business model and how you operate with Chinese companies, because they'll be very open to different models, but also nonetheless protecting your IP is very important. So identifying what is the core intellectual property and then being very open to share that which is not in order to develop your partners is a great way to build relationships and do business in China. Just lastly, here is a few slides up here of exhibitions in China around smart cities. So it's a great way to meet partners in China, to find out more about the industry, and to generally get to know the market is to attend these. So we've put a few on here. You can also get these in the Smart City Report, which you'd be welcome to download and read for a bit more detail on some of the subjects we've spoken about today. Thank you very much.